Okay, first of all, I know the history behind the WNBA. I know that both of those cities have had teams before and they got us where we're at, so I'm thankful.
What happens when a basketball player's little grievance regarding referees escalates into a major battle against a whole league? Sophie Cunningham learned the truth the hard way, and the WNBA's reaction has sent shockwaves that no one anticipated in the basketball world. Imagine that you are viewing your favorite team play, and you see the referees making some dubious decisions. You may gripe to your pals, perhaps share something on social media, but what if telling the truth cost you thousands of dollars and placed you in danger of officials in the league? Sophie Cunningham experienced precisely that, and her tale is going to reveal there is a considerably darker side to women's professional basketball. It all began quite casually. After witnessing yet another game with missed calls and dubious officiating, Sophie became irate. Made the choices that millions of fans do on a daily basis. On TikTok, she shared her candid opinions. However, in contrast to the others, the officials, in Sophie's opinion, were worthless. The 6 letters would be altered. Everything. She received a $500 fine from the WNBA within hours, shocking both players and fans. Most individuals would have moved on, apologized, and learned their lesson. However, Sophie Cunningham isn't the most individuals. Rather than retreating, she intensified her efforts. Sophie vented her annoyances on her show, where she did more than just defend. She elaborated on her prior remarks, disclosing information that the WNBA fervently hoped the public wouldn't learn. To be aware, she revealed players' general discontent with the officiating standards that had been covertly simmering for many years. The league's rapid and harsh response resulted in an additional $1,500 fine, increasing her total penalty to an astounding $2,000. However, this is the point at which the narrative becomes truly captivating. Rather of keeping Sophie quiet, the WNBA never anticipated what these fines would do. They made her a martyr. Overnight, social media took off, started going viral as fans learned they weren't the only ones who were frustrated. The indignation wasn't limited to the fines. It was about the obvious discrepancy in the league's response to various circumstances. Sophie was penalized several times for being honest, but other players, such as star Caitlin Clark, had been subjected to cruel treatment on the court for 2 entire seasons without receiving a single fine. Against the culprits, fans were not amused by the stark difference. In a few hours, Sophie's fine seemed to be covered by GoFundMe efforts, which nearly immediately achieved their objectives. Petitions calling for openness and officiating collected thousands of signatures in a record amount of time. The queries being posed were straightforward yet damning. Why penalize a player for expressing the obvious truth? Why disregard the demands for improvement? Responsibility. The WNBA had unintentionally sparked a movement, exactly what they were attempting to stop. However, you must recognize how the WNBA's strategy differs from that of other big basketball leagues in order to comprehend how he got here. League's outspoken NBA players like Draymond Green have built entire careers on more than just their abilities, but on their courageous candor. Because he spoke, Charles Barkley became a cultural icon. His thoughts honestly and unreservedly, questioning the game and its shortcomings. Supporters don't just put up with this. They applaud this kind of candor. It now forms an integral component of basketball's identity. The experience of Sophie Cunningham conveys a very different message, following her public criticism of referees for not protecting players. The reaction, which included Caitlin Clark, was terrifying. In front of her entire team, a league official drew her aside and, "They're going to find you again," she whispered. This was more than a simple rebuke. It was evident that the WNBA imposes severe restrictions on free expression, and the penalties are severe. Although the NBA uses the WNBA appears to adhere to a far tougher rulebook where speaking up carries hefty repercussions, despite its culture of open dialogue. The WNBA was unprepared to produce the ideal illustration of the Streisand effect, which occurs when attempts suppressing information will only cause it to proliferate. In their attempt to quiet Sophie Cunningham, they achieved precisely the opposite. Her punishment strengthened her voice and brought the officiating flaws under even more scrutiny. She had revealed, when you take into account the current controversies surrounding unpunished cheap shots against athletes such as Caitlin Clark, fans have been watching elite players for more than 2 years withstand risky hits that, in other leagues, would result in ejections. However, these occurrences have mostly gone without serious repercussions. DJ Carrington's close call, Marina Mabrey's vicious blindside hit that might have caused major harm to Clark's eye. These situations are now all too typical. In the meanwhile, Sophie Cunningham just when it is pointed out that referees are not performing their duties, the WNBA suddenly becomes obsessed with imposing punishment. It's like witnessing someone disregard a roaring fire in their home while Fixated on someone's failure to utilize a coaster, the pattern that shows up is really concerning. Have you ever felt uneasy after a WNBA game because the competition wasn't quite fair? That persistent annoyance is precisely what Sophie brought to the forefront, although she freely admits that officiating is difficult. However, the inconsistent officiating in the league is what really worries her. This has nothing to do with a few missed calls here and there. It concerns a systematic issue that influences how teams modify their tactics, how players repress their annoyance after games, and how supporters respond with growing rage. The recent occurrences of this issue is aptly illustrated by Caitlin Clark. During sports, elite players often take cheap shots without one whistle was blown. Questions reverberate throughout venues and flood social media. Why are these infractions not penalized? Why does it seem like the league ignores this? Fans from coast to coast, novices, and veterans all have the same perplexing questions. Query. What's happening with the referees? However, rather of resolving these issues, the league's reaction has been to penalize athletes who have the courage to speak up. Although the $500 fine may seem insignificant to some, it simply fueled an already raging fire instead of reducing hostilities. Sophie's tale became far more significant as a result of these sanctions. A call to action for all those who have been secretly dissatisfied with women's officiating. Basketball, the WNBA strategy differs significantly from that of other professional leagues. And worrisome, consider the NFL. Despite well-publicized errors, such as the notorious 2019 no call, the league upholds a far stronger sense of accountability during the Saints game. NFL referees are considered experts, whose choices are publicly examined and debated by players, fans, and the media. The gamers can express their annoyance regarding officiating without worrying about punishment. In fact, this transparency fosters trust even in the face of errors. The WNBA appears to be going in the complete opposite direction, concentrating more on appeasing detractors than resolving the underlying issues. Poor officiating causes far more harm than just altering game results, according to research. It fundamentally undermines trust. Fans begin to question the legitimacy and fairness of the entire league. Because they are afraid of fines and penalties that discourage open communication, players become reluctant to speak up. This starts a vicious cycle in which silence increases suspicion and may drive away the league's survival and expansion depend heavily on its players and supporters. What makes Sophie's circumstances the bureaucratic mess it turned into is even more bizarre. It feels like something to get penalized for talking about your own fines. Right out of a novel by Franz Kafka. On her podcast, Sophie described how her general manager took her aside in front of her teammates to inform them of another penalty, while admitting that certain referees are proficient and that, even though their work is extremely challenging, her remarks were insufficient to go past the league's stringent system of punishment. This exposes a basic flaw in the way issues are handled. If referees were regularly players like Sophie wouldn't feel pressured to publicly discuss making the correct decisions and upholding appropriate order on the court. Their annoyances, the fact that this is taking place indicates that there are significant problems with officiating standards. The league decided to disregard the criticism rather than address it and make improvements. Worries and increase the severity of punishment. Turning what ought to have been a straightforward grievance into a much larger debate concerning the boundaries of league power and free expression. There was no way that the timing could have been worse for the reputation of the WNBA. As soon as an opinion item in the Wall Street Journal raised due to worries that Caitlin Clark might have violated civil rights, the league found itself under a microscope for fostering what many perceive to be an antagonistic atmosphere where candid criticism is met with penalties and threats. Media outlets started to wonder if the WNBA creates an environment where players felt comfortable speaking up about valid worries. These days, it's not just about one player or one fine. Fans' reactions have been predictable fury, but it goes beyond the usual grievances on social media. They observe the gap between how the league functions and what it says it values. People are willing to cover Sophie's penalties, endorsing petitions for substantive officiating reform, and calling for far-reaching openness alterations. This reflects a great deal of dissatisfaction with leadership that appears to be more concerned with narrative control rather than tackling the underlying problems that are turning off players and supporters. The way the WNBA handled this whole, the players and supporters who are most passionate about the game are at danger of being estranged from the situation. When a league seems more inclined to punish sincere remarks than risky behavior, there are substantial concerns about the true priorities on the court. Sophie's critique wasn't provocative or impolite. No swearing or insulting remarks, just a straightforward statement that reflected the thoughts of innumerable spectators. However, the league's reaction was an obvious attempt rather than an attempt to listen and get better. To put an end to criticism, the fact that this strategy suppresses the real voices that could produce improved relationships with supporters, because outspoken personalities are encouraged, leagues like the NBA prosper. To express their opinions and question conventions, the WNBA's seen but not heard attitude runs the risk of making the sport into something uninteresting and unmemorable, exactly the antithesis of what a developing league requires. Sophie's podcast is energizing. This provides fans with real insight into the viewpoints of athletes. However, the WNBA punishes her each time she expresses valid concerns. There is no doubt about the message being conveyed. No criticism will be accepted, regardless of how constructive or fair it may be. This fosters an atmosphere where issues fester in silence until they grow too significant to be disregarded. This controversy's aftermath explains why the WNBA still has trouble gaining respect from the general public and acknowledgement when management prioritizes managing player speech over enhancing the final product. Growth becomes almost impossible. When the game is well run and fairly officiated, players don't feel compelled to publicly voice your complaints. However, no number of sanctions will stop the persistent annoyance caused by bad officiating. The truth from finally getting out, the tale of Sophie Cunningham began with a straightforward grievance about missed calls into a far more significant issue. An indication of a leadership crisis where image management is given priority over actual answers. There will undoubtedly be more disputes like this one until that basic strategy is altered. Now, the question is not whether the WNBA will continue to receive criticism, but rather whether they will ultimately decide to pay attention to it rather than attempting to stifle it with penalties and threats. The world of basketball is observing, and whether this controversy serves as a catalyst for constructive change will depend on the WNBA's future course of action. Change, or simply another instance of a league that prioritized control over expansion. Sophie Cunningham might have been the first. She started a controversy with a straightforward TikTok video, but it has the potential to change women's basketball eternally.